Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks very much to Andreas for organizing this. This is a really exciting opportunity for me to be able to have this conversation kind of in this context with some of the leading researchers and sort of thinkers around IO toys and kind of technologized play in general. And as Andreas mentioned, I'm approaching the sort of theme of the bootcamp from a slightly distinct vantage point. I teach in a department called Childhood Studies, which is a multidisciplinary department at Rutgers University, where researchers are interested in childhood from all sorts of disciplinary perspectives. So literature, sociology, anthropology, and my kind of orientation is from film and media studies. But as I hope to sort of demonstrate, my interest and sort of research ongoing with toys has sort of pulled me in different directions. And so I hope that some of the sort of methods that I have to share today, which might be a departure from some of the work that is ongoing at IMC, will very much represent a complementary research tradition, and that they'll be generative and sort of open up into further discussions and possibilities for how exactly do we work with toys today, and what can we learn from kind of historical toy development practices. So I wanted to start with an example from June of this year. The California-based toy company Mattel announced a new Hot Wheels line called Hot Wheels ID. It's a collection of track sets, cars, and a companion app. And the press release celebrated Hot Wheels ID as what they called a groundbreaking new play system bringing together physical and digital play. The product's website elaborated on this a little bit, explaining the distinct play that this toy set was meant to inspire. They wrote, "For 50 years, kids have bragged about their Hot Wheels cars. My car is faster, my car can jump farther, my car can do 100 laps. Now they can prove it. Every speed clocked, every loop tracked, every collection recorded. Each vehicle has a unique ID with its very own data, so kids can prove their racing skills to everyone." So the specific technological features of Hot Wheels ID notwithstanding, the interest or the desire to measure cars' speeds, of course, extends back much further in history. If we look just a few years earlier, the Hot Wheels True Speed app developed by the Lola Mullenlow agency transformed users' digital devices into speedometers that would clock speeds at both kind of real-time and 1/64th scale. If you go back 2 years before that, the Hot Wheels Track Builder line came out with a digital speedometer accessory that was sold as part of that line. Introduced in 2006 and very rapidly discontinued after that was the speed radar gun, which similarly would clock speeds and sort of adjust them for scale. And if we rewind all the way back to 1969, which was the year after the Hot Wheels brand was sort of initiated, we had speedometer sets available. So, although the technology associated with this new Hot Wheels ID line is of course new and unprecedented in many ways, the kinds of sort of play that Hot Wheels cars have meant to inspire over time, competitive racing toys, competitive racing kinds of play, have remained fairly consistent, whether in the physical or the digital realm. And I believe that this kind of historical contextualization has a great deal to contribute to kind of ongoing research and public discourse surrounding contemporary connected toys. My point is not necessarily to suggest in a very broad sense that all new media is old, but rather to suggest that a broad assemblage of technologies has been responsible for encouraging very particular play patterns kind of over time. Such historical approaches, I think, can really intervene in the kinds of polarized discourses around children's play that Andreas was talking about, right? The sense that, the sort of popular sense that digital play is somehow corrupting physical play practices, that in fact, many of the same inclinations have been built into toy design over the years. On the one hand, new media, of course, are commonly met with optimism and enthusiasm for their potential to transform learning and play, and in some cases, even ameliorate social inequalities. And we could think about the kind of growth of the STEM toy industry as an example of this, which Hot Wheels is very involved in. They make classroom kits to encourage kids to think about measurement and speed and so forth. And we could think about kind of STEM toys for girls in particular as opportunities to sort of imagine kind of socially progressive play patterns. On the other hand, of course, new media are commonly sort of the fuel for moral panics about lost competencies, waning literacies, and sort of lack of social connections. But common to both of these kind of extreme extreme responses is the idea that kids today are inhabiting a play space that's radically different than previous generations. And I think researching technologized play in a longer historical context helps to evaluate this assertion a little bit more carefully. We can consider children's play within centuries-long traditions of technology and playthings, as well as sort of highlighting the attributes of modern playthings that do appear to break with past practices. I think historical perspectives also open up new methods and procedures for material and discursive analysis, and many of these methods are complementary to the tools that contemporary digital researchers already employ. So they offer extended frameworks for theorizing complex bundles of physical, digital, and sort of human users kind of working together. Historical play experiences in particular are inaccessible via direct observation or ethnographic means, and I think this is a really important limitation to acknowledge of this kind of research, given how rapidly technology obsolesces, that we can only capture kids' play experiences sort of in the moment, and once technologies are sort of deemed old, right, or obsolete, then how do we sort of reclaim opportunities to think about them? And this has come up a lot for me because many of the products that I've studied are already gone, and I think a great example of this is the toys to life sort of game industry, which has sort of waxed and waned already. So in my talk today, I want to highlight several methods for the analysis of toys as media, or toys and media. I want to introduce several tools to kind of play with and think through, and I'll draw from a series of previously published, forthcoming, and sort of ongoing research case studies, kind of a breadth versus depth approach rather than kind of a single case study in depth. And I want to not only kind of introduce these methods, but also demonstrate how the application of these methods can help us open up a larger critical discussion about sort of toy research today, exploring, for example, how such historical excavation gives us opportunities to think about a longer history of toys as media, and to rethink kind of foundational concepts like interactivity. So what can historical approaches sort of lend to this? So to kind of briefly situate my work, as I mentioned, I come from a film and media studies background, and my forthcoming book examines 19th century children's media culture. I look at optical toys like the stereoscope and the zoetrope as new media of their time, and particularly as children's toys, and make the argument that essentially they were as kind of recognizable and as common as things like a kite or a top or a ball. And I argue that modern childhood and modern media culture were mutually influential phenomena. So today, when we invest digital technologies with optimism, or conversely, when new media is critiqued for kind of fundamentally eroding elements of childhood and play, we're actually drawing upon a 200-year history when media culture and modern childhood sort of simultaneously came into being and sort of informed one another. So to conduct this work required a variety of methodologies that were new to me kind of as a film studies person. I had to combine a lot of discursive analysis with material kind of hands-on analysis with these toys. My PhD advisor said, find these toys in the world and play with them. And that was sort of the directive. And so I did. I visited archives around the world, and I really sort of thought about what it meant to handle these toys in the archival context, how that differed or was similar to the original kind of play practices. And from that work, I published kind of separately a little bit about play as a research methodology. So not only do we observe play, but what does it mean for researchers themselves to become players in this situation? So this research went on to kind of inspire later work, such as a piece I wrote on the Toys to Life video game, Disney Infinity, where I thought a little bit about Walt Disney's legacy as a creative genius as a way of framing the game as a creative platform to kind of mitigate against critiques that, screen-based play is sort of taking away from kind of fundamentally physical play. A forthcoming book chapter on talking dolls uses archival material such as patent records to explore the relationships between the technological interiors of these dolls and their sort of lifelike or realistic exteriors, and sort of how those two kind of components contrast with one another. Basically, I was interested in understanding, like, why are talking dolls always considered creepy, and why do people keep making them? So what's going on there? So I come from a media studies background, but as I've been drawn to toys, I've really been interested in sort of material culture analysis, which is a tradition that's grown largely out of art history, anthropology, as well as the interdisciplinary methods used by childhood studies scholars. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those methods here. The study of IoTs involves a range of methods, which often pull together visual, material, and discursive evidence. We think about things from the political economy of toys and apps and the reception of popular imaginations to, of course, the complexities involved in children's actual play practices. Connected playthings demand rigorous consideration from many angles, in part because the kinds of play that they inspire are unprecedented on so many levels. So we can think of work such as recent chapters in the foundational book, The Internet of Toys, by Van Meliken, Zaman, Bloomers, and Marion, who have pioneered experimental methods in participatory design, which take seriously children's perspectives as stakeholders in the design process. Similarly, Mascaroni and Holloway have elaborated upon Light, Burgess, and Dugray's walkthrough method for the analysis of apps. This is a method which emphasizes materiality, symbolic dimensions, and social actors' everyday practices, and that considers toys as media interfaces. So to these methods that treat the contemporary playscape in such nuanced and thoughtful ways, I wish to advocate for the addition of a historical approach, which brings two distinct contributions. First, the tools to use and analyze historical media, such as methods pioneered in media archaeology, material culture studies, and recent work in childhood studies that draws upon performance theories and material analysis, represents a complementary set of analytical methods. These methods have been variously used in their own disciplines to identify the artifacts unearthed in archaeological digs, or to sort of ask questions around how racial politics were sustained in the 19th century. So they're wide-ranging methods that have been applied in different ways. But I think they're in surprising alignment with much of the work going on with IoTs. And I think these methods also bring new procedures and new questions and fresh perspectives that are applicable to the study of contemporary playthings. Secondly, by looking to historical media technologies and toys as case studies, we can better recognize the distinct features of IO toys today. Historical media can reveal striking continuities in the way that toy makers have imagined children's play in the past, even as the specific technologies have changed. But comparative historical analysis also helps us highlight the attributes of modern playthings that do appear as radical breaks with past practices. And if we think about the 6 perspectives or kind of research priority discussed as the kaleidoscope on the Internet of Toys, I think historical approaches most obviously kind of impact 3 of them. Thinking about media, commercial, and public discourses, which of course are never just contemporary, they always sort of build on a residual past conversation. Thinking about the changing nature of play, right, ways that play is reimagined or kind of imagined anew, and then finally thinking about how kind of industry stakeholders and academics can work together to imagine sort of play practices that are ethical that will kind of contribute to a better world. I think in some ways these other categories are definitely kind of applicable from a historical lens. For example, I'm in the very early stages of sort of thinking about the prehistory of datafication with children. So I don't know if you've heard, but next month Pampers is coming out with a set of smart diapers that sort of, when the child uses the diaper, the app highlights, whatever. So it's another form of kind of, measuring and sort of datafying kind of, biological experiences. And I'm interested in kind of thinking about these kinds of products connected to the longer history in the US of baby contests, baby weighing contests and baby health contests, and how other kinds of biometric data have always been sort of valued in certain ways. So I'd be happy to kind of talk a little bit more about this, but I think most salient to the conversation, these 3 kind of perspectives can really be augmented through historical analysis. So, as a scholar trained in film and media studies and who researches toys and now works within a childhood studies department, my work has really kind of coalesced at the intersection of media archaeology, material culture, and childhood studies, itself a multidisciplinary field. A central premise of media archaeology is that alternative and surprising historical histories can be excavated alongside conventional or dominant historical narratives. The field provides, in the words of Laurie Emerson, a sobering conceptual friction to the current culture of the new that dominates contemporary computing. It's an approach, UC Perico writes, that sees cultures as sedimented and layered, a fold of time and materiality where the past might be suddenly discovered anew. Urki Hutamo and Perico write, media archaeologists have begun to construct alternate histories of suppressed, neglected, and forgotten media that do not point to the present media cultural condition as their perfection. Dead ends, losers, and inventions that never made it into a material product all have important stories to tell. And I think that this critical orientation has much to offer when we think about IoTs, where we've already seen many examples of kind of failures or fads or forgotten playthings, such as many of the products that I initially became interested in researching. We could think, for instance, of Mattel's early Aptivity line around 2012, which was a series of kind of plastic playthings that sat on top of tablets. We could, of course, simply disregard these things as sort of failed experiments, but I think to disregard these kinds of examples misses opportunities to inquire about how they attempted to configure play and leverage particular technological affordances. For example, activity products tended to imagine the touchscreen as sort of a flat interface to be played upon, right, and sort of spatialized play in that way. And we can see already a distinct contrast with, 5 years later, Mattel's collaboration with Osmo on Hot Wheels Mind Racers, which was obviously via this plastic mechanism spatializes play differently to have physical toys sort of disappear into the virtual space and sort of race that way. And so I think it's really kind of interesting to sort of catalog what these things looked like and how they imagined kids played in sort of different formations. Moreover, as particular genres and markets have come or gone, such as toys to life games, to simply dismiss them as failures really disregards the millions of interactions that children have had with them and the significant role that they've played in children's lives. So if we think, for example, about Toys to Life, if a child was 7 or something when the first Skylanders game came out in 2011, if they played through that series until 2018 when the last installment was made, the kid was 14. And so really their whole kind of childhood was really kind of deeply inspired by this franchise, and they're probably really into it in a lot of ways. So to simply say like, well, that, you know, we no longer make those toys, we're no longer interested in them, I think disregards children's real lived play practices that have been important and have played a major role. And we can sort of see residual components of this, right, in children's media production practices, kids using their Toys to Life figures to make stop motion animations on YouTube and things like that. So life goes on with these things, and I think they're important to acknowledge. So one media archaeological method that allows us to understand these kinds of experiences, even considered technologies that are no longer new, is what is called the reenactment. Whereas many studies of toys include observations of children's play from field notes, structured interviews, or GoPro chest cams, for example, it's simply not possible to capture historical children's play practices except in rare instances when there's diaries or video recordings themselves kind of their own set of particular evidence that has some things to sort of think through critically. But there are other ways of considering this kind of play, and Andreas Fickers and Annie Vandenhover described reenactment as basically a hands-on engagement with media artifacts to put the researcher in the position of the user. Thinking about the user, they write, is more assertive and action-oriented instead of the socioeconomic and media studies categories of audience and consumer. And I think sort of reframing this kind of terminology in this way is really important to, you know, kind of take seriously the kind of ethical qualms around sort of just thinking of children in economic terms, right, and to sort of take seriously their roles as stakeholders in the play process a little bit. The reenactment enables experimenters to reflect critically on the hidden or non-verbalized or sensorial or corporeal tacit knowledge that informs our engagement with media technologies. And here I think the reenactment bears clear resemblance to the walkthrough method devised by Light et al. In the systematic analysis of apps. It's really valuable because it can resensitize experimenters to the sensorial and performative dimensions of media use and sharpen our attention to aspects or lack thereof in the source material. And although it kind of sounds straightforward, in order to understand a technology, you have to interact with it. It sounds very logical and kind of, I guess, assumed that one would do that. I think many approach something from the perspective of simply wanting to know how it works. And I think that's a real distinction between the reenactment method, which is sort of interested in how we engage with it, not simply how it works. works. And this really came up a lot for me in research for my book. As a museum educational professional for a number of years, I watched thousands of museum visitors look at the zoetrope. I should have brought one, but you spin the thing and you look through the slots and it looks like the thing is moving, you know, the figures are moving. And what's really striking is that 9 times out of 10, someone will spin the thing and look down through the top and think like, oh, it's not working. And you have to sort of get down to the side and look through, and then you see it's working. And so what really struck me is that sort of contemporarily, many people look at the zoetrope the wrong way first before they discover the right way. And similarly, in the historical record, children are often depicted looking at the zoetrope in the wrong way. So in this image, none of them would be able to see it working correctly. And again, this is a promotional image. That's not necessarily the point. If you look at this kind of patent image, you see you have to be kind of directly at eye level. But this became a really important observation because what I found is that this kind of mechanism of performative trial and error was actually key to the zoetrope's pedagogy, because playing with it gave kids a sense of visual mastery. So the ability to apprehend this kind of optical illusion and say, I see what's going on, I know how it works, was kind of central to themselves as media spectators, but also as social subjects. That they then felt kind of armed as middle-class citizens to, you know, go out into the city and not be tricked by con men and things like that. So it was attached to a lot of other social practices, this ability to kind of see the image the wrong way and then the right way. So the performative quality associated with reenactment also closely recalls material culture methods that have made significant contributions in childhood studies in recent years. In her book Racial Innocence from 2011, Robin Bernstein proposes a method of reading material things as scripts, which aims to discover not only what any individual actually did, but rather what a thing invited users to do. This act of scripting, she explains, this issuing of a culturally specific invitation is itself a historical event, one that can be recovered and then analyzed as a fresh source of evidence. And so to think about things in this way, I think is really interesting, how things issue invitations for us to interact. And invitations, of course, are framed by material factors, such as an object's design or the materials that it's made out of, but also social assumptions and expectations, discursive contexts like instructions, etc. And key to the theory of descriptive scriptive things is the notion that historical actors maintain agency. So we can choose to follow or disregard an object's scripts. And that's really important. Obviously, it avoids kind of technologically determinist readings of objects. And Seth Giddings, I think, describes user agency with smart toys in very similar terms. He notes that broader technological imaginaries are no mere abstractions. Or illusions. They shape the design and reception of toys as technologies, facilitating and scaffolding certain kinds of play while never fully determining it. They mesh the material characteristics and operations of the technology, the culture and society of the play environment, and images and dramas from the children's environment, not least with the phantasmagorical imaginations of the children themselves. So analyses to unpack the scripts of technological objects and artifacts powerfully maintain user agency, but they also suggest how the style and design affordances and discursive context of objects naturalize certain kinds of uses and discourage others or resist other possibilities. So in other words, scripts allow us to imagine the likely uses of objects and to speculate about how those uses corporeally engage users. Approaching IoTs as scriptive things helps us understand their potential for shaping play. I teach an undergraduate course in toy design for which students complete a series of play labs, a kind of walkthrough or reenactment where they analyze a toy product into its design components. So they think about its affordances, its constraints, its signifiers, its conceptual model, etc. For one such lab, we used Crayola's Easy Animator product. Users color a character, as I have done here, and then they map that kind of colored image onto a posable mannequin, which they can then sort of capture with the app and arrange into different positions, and then those positions are sort of stitched together into an animated sequence. This is one that I made, just so you can see what it looks like, kind of. It's really kind of cool. So when my students worked with this tool or this toy in their play lab, it became clear that even though coloring the avatar offers a degree of customization, you can choose its coloring basically and sort of the poses that you want, although there are some pre-programmed poses as well. There are still kind of other forms of customization that my students in particular really wanted to see. So immediately they drew a sword and a hat onto the avatar, which you can see there. And this is a really good example of how the toy and the app offer a clear script for the user. So although it's possible to kind of add these details via the coloring book as a form, that data becomes irrelevant when you scan it into the app. The sword doesn't stay, while it kind of shows up on the hand there. But it's erased essentially. And so in that way, the scripts don't necessarily encourage you to do that in particular ways. And I think another thing that's really sort of striking is that when you think about a coloring book and the sort of affordances of a coloring book or the scripts that a coloring book might issue, one of the biggest things is to get kids to color inside the lines, right? And of course they don't have to, but that's sort of like the intended use. And what's very striking about this is that you don't have to do that. You can color anywhere you want on the page, and only the material on the avatar's body will be retained in the scan. And so in that way, this product kind of inverts the scripts of the coloring book in sort of a surprising way. So another group in my class worked with a Hasbro product introduced in 2016 called the Play-Doh Shape to Life Studio. A set of small cans of the modeling compound were sold alongside this kind of scanning station with a series of shape stampers. And the idea was that you shape Play-Doh creations, scan them, and they come to life in a kind of platformer style virtual world. This product I always found really striking because Play-Doh is arguably one of the most tactile toys imaginable. So I was really fascinated by Hasbro's decision to make something called Play-Doh Touch, which seems to sort of be redundant with what the product actually does. But of course the idea is to kind of digitize the sort of manual experience and sort of build upon the kind of terminology of touchscreen technology in certain ways. So when I tested the toy prior to bringing it into the classroom, I was really excited because you can scan anything, not just Play-Doh. So I just tried a few things that I had kind of around my house. I had a Brio train on my desk and some crayons. And you can see what's kind of cool is that the app actually enables you to kind of transform anything into a sort of digital Play-Doh via its sort of physics engine that makes everything sort of bouncy and fun. So this was kind of a great instance to me of ways that the scripts were kind of open for kids to kind of play with outside the kind of framework of what was intended. So I was excited about that, but then I was also really curious because, of course, these kinds of activities are not only kind of not necessarily sanctioned by the app, but they're actually prohibited by the app's terms of service. So this was wrong that I did this. The user agreement stipulates that users are prohibited from uploading or submitting any data or information that is protected by intellectual property. So no. And then kind of more vaguely, attempting to use the app for any purposes other than those intended by us, as determined by us in our sole and absolute discretion. And so what's interesting about that is that users actually don't know what that is, right? Like, what is the line there? So I think it's probably fine that I did it just for a demo, but technically prohibited. And so, of course, this is sort of one instance of how kind of contemporary playthings sort of shift the framework around children's play by including this kind of legal language, right? With a sort of non-technologized toy, of course, you can disregard its scripts without kind of breaking the law, right? Or sort of violating a terms of service. So just kind of an interesting example. And I wanted to offer just a final example of scripting and thinking about how scripting illustrates how platforms for creative production issue particular directives around play and what the consequences of that might be. So of course there's been a spate of coding platforms designed for children which literally invite young users to write scripts for programmable elements. Yet even these open-ended opportunities still script or configure users in very telling ways. Around 2015, the UK coding platform partnered with the kids entertainment network Nickelodeon the coding platform Codit to sort of bring Nickelodeon's intellectual properties into the Codit sort of coding interface. And so already you can see from the experience, users were invited to select your universe, basically decide the theme of the programmable elements that you wanted to code. So I chose SpongeBob, and you can sort of see that the predetermined scripts associated with SpongeBob here are slime, laugh, dance, fart, or scare. So those are the choices. And I just think it's interesting to sort of think about how these choices, which obviously are in line with Nickelodeon's brand ethos, the kind of gross out oppositional ethos, suggest certain kinds of play over others. Kids' coding environments are traditionally kind of invested with sort of sentiments about kids developing STEM skills, kids sort of thinking about problem-solving skills that will be relevant to the workplace, right, or in civic engagement. Yet here they're sort of reduced to this kind of oppositional gross-out humor. And so one could imagine, what if these choices were like, SpongeBob votes, SpongeBob protests, and of course, like, that would probably not be a very satisfying play experience, right? It would be overly didactic and not very sort of fulfilling, we can imagine. But I think given the amount of attention around IoTs, around imagining children as civically engaged subjects, imagining sort of thinking about children's rights and children's citizenship, it's worth sort of taking a step back and thinking about how design affordances and scripts sort of envision in very implicit ways even a kind of civically minded user, right? And Nickelodeon has historically kind of used the language of citizenship as a mechanism for consumption, right? You're participating through buying and so forth. And Sarah Benet Weiser and Heather Hendershot have written about this a little bit. So I think just in terms of scripting, it's worth sort of thinking about how particular mindsets shape user expectations of a platform. So with a couple of the methods introduced, and I have a few more to share, I want to think about how this kind of inquiry allows us to sort of think differently about foundational concepts. In their recent book, The Internet of Toys, Mascherani and Holloway argue for the importance of considering IoTs from a media and communications perspective. And this approach, they argue, will help us understand and situate the social consequences of the entanglements of objects, data, and communication practices that constitute the IO toys at both micro or individual levels or macro kind of social, political, economic levels. And many connected playthings actively invite us to sort of think about them as media. I think Play-Doh Touch is a great example of this, right? It was sort of sold in these kind of strikingly similar to MacBook boxes. There was a limited editional available only through the Apple Store. So obviously, toy designers and sort of product designers are interested in sort of making these kinds of connections. Within history and media studies, toys have largely been regarded from a media and communication perspective on an industrial level. Nigel Thrift marks a key shift in the expansion of commodified toys, which he links to radio shows in the 1920s having toy tie-ins, right, or licensed merchandise like Mickey Mouse dolls and Shirley Temple dolls in the 1920s and 30s. Many media studies scholars and historians sort of see this kind of trend reaching a fever pitch in the 1970s and 80s when more relaxed television regulation, commercial television regulation in the United States gave way to what was called the PLC, or program length commercial. So a 30-minute cartoon that was exclusively designed to sell its corresponding toy line. So He-Man was an example, of course, many other kinds of examples. So I think the link between toys and media has a much longer genesis that's less industrial and has more to do with the kinds of play and engagement that these objects inspire. And one such example, I think, is a new research project that I'm working on surrounding the kind of origins of stop-motion animation. In his 1952 memoir, the animator Albert E. Smith tells a famous story in which he claims that he and his partner, James Stewart Blackton, who founded Vitagraph Studios, made the first stop-motion film. And they made it, they said, with toys and inspired by toys. He wrote, "We made the first stop-motion picture in America, the Humpty Dumpty Circus. I used my little daughter's set of wooden toy circus performers and animals whose movable joints enabled us to place them in balanced positions." And he said that it was quite a tedious method to do. And Smith claims that this happened in 1898, which is quite early for this kind of technique to be pioneered. And For a long time, film scholars have sort of pushed back against this story. It didn't seem quite right. These two tended to kind of make claims on intellectual property sort of when they were sort of in patent wars with various other competitors. But what's really striking to me is that film and media scholars have not turned to one of the most obvious tools to sort of verify or disprove this story, namely the toys themselves. And so I simply looked up when were the Humpty Dumpty Circus toys made, and it was in 1903, so 5 years later. So the story's not true, but what's interesting, I think, is that the toys' design attributes make the story's claim plausible, and I think in many respects the toys themselves were very related to early animation. And material sculptor Jules David Brown introduced a 3-step method for sort of thinking about physical objects that helped me explore this question in a little bit more depth. Brown's method involves a systematic survey of objects through description, deduction, and speculation. He formulated his method with the belief that material artifacts have a lot to tell us about the cultures that produce them and their meanings in ways that are distinct from traditional sources like text. And again, I think this is in keeping with the idea that discursive materials answer some questions but not others. This systematic method is very helpful when it comes to analyzing objects that we don't know what they are. So if you're wanting to do kind of a reenactment with a media object but you're not sure how to begin, you can begin quite simply by collecting data about it. So describing it in a really sort of thorough way, measuring it, weighing it, seeing what materials it's made out of, determining what is the top, what is the bottom, sort of basic steps like that. And description involves collecting as much of this data as possible. And when you do that with these toys, you find that they have joints that are very elastic, so you can move their arms in both kind of realistic or fantastical ways. And really critically, they hold their position. So the joints are cut in such a way that they hold whatever position that you put them in, much like the mannequin on the stop-motion animator. And so looking at these things sort of made me think about the different configurations they could be posed in. They also have grooves in the bottom of their feet, which you can't see here, and in their hands, which allow them to attach to ladders, chairs, etc. And there was a really broad variety of accessories you could buy for them. So these attributes, I think, all made them ideal objects to be used in stop-motion animation, which was interesting to me. And so I began to sort of infer that, well, maybe the play that they inspired was very closely kind of related to this idea of posing and posability. And Brown acknowledges that once you've sort of completed these first steps and you move to kind of speculating, you form hypotheses, but then you have to test them against external evidence. So I went from the toys themselves outward. Promotional materials, intellectual property materials such as patents, other early stop-motion films, to sort of think about whether I could make the claim that these toys in fact were designed according to the logic of stop-motion animation. So I first went to the patent, and indeed the patent really kind of prioritizes showcasing the fact that they can move in any position and that they hold that position via a kind of central string that runs like a spinal cord, and then elastic joints fitted together with pins. You can also kind of get a sense of the grooves in their hands and feet, again, to kind of hold things. And although, of course, they don't appear in 1898 because they didn't exist, they do crop up in a bunch of early animations, even though they're not credited. So in James Stewart Blackton's Haunted Hotel in 1907, a teapot opens and one of these clowns pops out. And no one would know this unless you just watched all the films and hoped to see them, which I did. And a year later, in 1908, a film made by Arthur Melbourne Cooper called Dreams in Toyland showcases what turns out to be a kind of violent fight among some toys, but many of these toys, again, are show and hut figures, not credited as such, but the horse, there's a goat at one part, some ducks. These two in the foreground are not show and huts, but you get the sense that they were kind of part of the milieu of playthings at this time. So this is really important. The same year, a film called The Humpty Dumpty Circus did come out. That film's not surviving, but a short description in Moving Picture World emphasizes the labor intensity of stop-motion animation. It says, when we consider that there are 12 pictures to a foot of film and there are 885 feet in the Humpty Dumpty subject, we begin to realize the magnitude of the task. And so emphasizing the kind of labor intensiveness of stop-motion animation production was very interesting to me. And when I looked to the Schoenhut marketing materials, Albert Schoenhut being the toy maker who made these things, what I find is that he advertised them as being able to perform 1001 tricks. And he published these really extensive booklets which showcase not only the sets that you could buy, but also the different configurations. So the different kind of, poses and shapes that you could make with these amazing toys. And some of these are duplicates, right? You're not going to buy 5 hippopotamuses, right? So there's kind of excessive commercialism here, but I think the point is that not only did these toys kind of inspire animation production, right, and literally feature in animation production, but in turn they inspired play practices that almost invited kids to model the process of stop motion itself. So even though kids weren't filming themselves, they were nevertheless kind of thinking about these different poses. And these are just some excerpts of very extensive booklets with these different kinds of images in them. So I wanted to go kind of a step further and sort of thinking about, how might these toys design further kind of be imbricated in the history of screen culture. Albert Schoenhut was based in Philadelphia and was kind of doing his work in the end of the 19th century. And just a couple of decades before he went into kind of toy production, we had Edward Muybridge, who was a motion study experimenter at the University of Pennsylvania just right across town. And Muybridge was very interested in kind of capturing and analyzing animal motion and sort of breaking it down systematically. And he lectured widely. His work was kind of published widely. So it's definitely not a stretch to imagine that Schoenhut would have seen and been familiar with Muybridge's work and was interested not in the same kind of physiological precision that Muybridge was interested in, but in thinking about animals moving, right, and sort of how we can make animals move. And you can see just some comparisons here, right? The same kinds of animals being made, Muybridge, of course, and then Schoenhut. There's the kangaroo. But then what was really striking was that some of Schoenhut's advertising materials, in fact, sort of used the horizontal compositions that Muybridge used. So you have the strong sense that not only are these toys inspiring animation and inspiring animation like play, but in fact they're fundamentally inspired by earlier kind of moving image practices. So this was obviously a really exciting kind of realization for me. And you might be thinking, okay, well, why is this relevant to the study of sort of tech toys today? And the answer to that is that if we're interested in kind of nuancing or challenging these sort of assumptions that technologized play is new, right, or that screen culture and sort of children's play are fundamentally different things, right, and that digital play kind of corrupts traditional play practices, that's not an accurate argument given that for over 100 years now, children's toys have been manufactured and sort of operate according to the logic of moving image media. So I think when we sort of think about rationales for talking about toys as media, what's really important is that these rationales exist not only kind of at an industrial level in terms of licensing and those kinds of arrangement, but on the level of perception itself, right? The idea that figures move in particular ways, which are commensurate with kind of the movement of screen-based technologies. So another point that I wanted to sort of push against a little bit is interactivity and imagining how other foundational concepts might sort of be pushed a little bit. Much like the walkthrough method of Light, Burgess, and Duguay, this kind of traditional material analysis with discursive analysis means that if we want to understand an app or a particular toy, we have to think about all of the sort of framing that goes along with it. So in the case of the walkthrough method, we think about its vision, its operating model, and its governance, basically a collection of contextual or paratextual materials that clarify an app's purpose and its intended uses, its political economy, and the regulatory frameworks governing its use. And connected playthings produced by legacy or heritage brands, I think, are particularly interested to study. That's why I'm interested in companies like Crayola or Mattel or Hasbro, because they have these kind of rich legacies to sort of build upon and authenticate their digital products. And these also represent part of their vision, right? Part of the way that they're framing their sort of new products. So it's interesting, for instance, that Hot Wheels announced its True Speed app and sort of advertised it playfully as an app to get kids off apps. And a lot of the material sort of talked about how this is making one of the most popular physical games relevant again. And it's like, well, was it irrelevant? Perhaps, you could look at the numbers, right? But sort of thinking about how companies have leeway to sort of authenticate their products or sort of playfully contradict themselves or challenge them in different ways. Another example that I've looked at was a product developed in 2012 by Johnson & Johnson's Band-Aid adhesive bandage company. So Band-Aid Magic Vision enabled you to scan Band-Aids, which were AR markers, and an experience would sort of come to life to distract children from their pain. And on the left here, I just have kind of an example to show that Band-Aid is really kind of consistent with its branding, right? To say that the application of Band-Aid is always about kind of a health moment, but it's also about kind of usually maternal nurturing, right? And about kind of affective care. And so what's interesting is that with Magic Vision, Band-Aid is able to kind of leverage digital affordances to say, like, it's great that the Band-Aid will distract them from being hurt, right? Usually we don't want digital technology to distract kids, and in this case it works to Band-Aid's advantage to do that. So there are kind of striking continuities to see, but there are also really interesting contrasts. So in the 1970s, Crayola had a really kind of wonderful ad campaign developed by Churig and Cairns, which featured kind of commercials with children playing quietly, often with kind of whimsical calliope music in the background, and with an internal monologue describing what they were drawing, right? An undersea explosion, you know, whatever, and really interesting stuff. And then the tagline, of course, was Crayola crayons, they work on brains, not batteries, right? So Crayola was really interested in positioning itself as like a non-tech company. Flash forward, of course, and we have Crayola's Color Alive, which sort of builds on that. Color Alive was a set of kind of augmented reality coloring books with special crayons that unlocked different features. So here we have a downstairs shot of parents saying, oh, our kids are just upstairs coloring, it's no big deal. And then upstairs, of course, it's very perilous for the children as they're battling this dragon, right? So by looking at kind of an app's sort of longer legacy that encompasses its vision, we can sort of think about these points of comparison and contrast in really interesting ways. And a really important point of departure for me has been Nigel Thrift's 2013 article, Closer to the Machine, which he was writing at a time when he began observing the spaces of everyday life kind of being taken over by connected things. He wrote, increasingly commodities are being loaded up with software, and he argued what's interesting is how many of the most successful of these new live commodities are proving to be toys. And Thrift was writing in 2003, and he worked with a kind of limited definition of what he called truly interactive super toys, like Tamagotchi or Furby. Basically, toys with the ability to interact physically in a reactive fashion rather than simply producing mechanical responses so that they can be regarded as adaptive, at least in some way. And at the time of his writing, there were a spate of new playthings, particularly technologized dolls, the MGA My Real Baby doll, My Dream Baby, and Miracle Moves Baby. All of these dolls kind of grew cognitively from infancy to toddlerhood. My Dream Baby actually physically grew with a telescoping torso, so it kind of, it's quite an amazing doll to see. Its arms are kind of perpetually bent to facilitate crawling, and you can reset it. Again, it's fun. So you can sort of think about how he was interested in sort of talking about this moment of unprecedented interactivity in playthings when everything was sort of changing a bit in the early 21st century. But I found his definition of interactivity interesting, and I wanted to sort of see if I could trace it back further. How have toy makers conceived of interactivity differently in different historical moments? Media and communication scholar Jens F. Jensen offered a slightly more nuanced definition of interactivity, writing in 1998, so a little bit earlier. He calls interactivity a measure of media's potential ability to let the user exert an influence on the content and or form of the media-mediated communication. So I think this broader definition of interactivity invites us to consider not only what constitutes authentic creativity or interactivity, but rather a relationship between interactivity and play value. So I wanted to explore this in perhaps the most simple toy possible. How does interactivity look in something like a bouncy ball, right? And on a certain sense, this would fit with Jensen's definition of interactivity. It enables the user to sort of throw the ball, which is subject to a number of systems and a number of conditions, and experience feedback in the form of a bounce back, right? And although the ball itself is incapable of adapting, the user is able to adapt it, right, by throwing it at different angles, throwing it in the wind, throwing it against different materials, putting a spin on it, hitting with their hand, whatever. So there are lots of sort of material affordances of this physical object that would allow us, or kind of give us a rationale for thinking about it as interactive. And maybe you're skeptical and you're like, great, the ball is interactive. But I think what's sort of striking about this is that the marketing sort of framework for this ball was also really concerned with interactivity in these same terms. So these balls were sort of made out of synthetic rubber. They came out in the mid-1960s. One of the companies that made them was called Whammo, under the brand Super Ball. And if we look at the commercial for this, the adult announcer says, look, it's almost alive. It bounces and bounces. It keeps going and going almost forever. So it's being described as this kind of perpetual motion machine that has a mind of its own, which of course we know it doesn't, but it's sort of framed in the same way. And the ball is hailed as a scientific triumph, not only because of the height of its bounces, but precisely because of the unpredictability of its bounces. So a slow motion sequence kind of broke this down further, where we see this fellow kind of interacting with the ball, and the kind of voiceover says, Super Ball is a mystery ball of 1,000 bounces. Strange, weird, makes every bounce a game, every game more magical. And so, although this is, promotional language, I think what's key is that the advertising emphasizes the ball precisely in the language of interactivity, and in this case, interactivity is sort of equated with unpredictability, right? So this is how they use kind of synthetic rubber to imagine an interactive play material in some way. And this same understanding of interactivity as unpredictability shows up in other toys of this era, the 1960s, and other toys that we might more traditionally associate with technology or sort of media. And so one example is the sort of famous Mattel Chatty Cathy dolls. So Mattel produced a line of these talking dolls, which were activated by a pull string at the nape of their neck. And you can kind of see the speaker grill in the front. And so talking dolls had been around for a long time by the 1960s. But the key with Chatty Cathy was that, she had this kind of small phonograph and tone arm mounted vertically inside the chest cavity with little records that sort of played around. But engineer Jack Ryan came up with a hallmark feature of these voice units, a randomization mechanism. So essentially, if you look, I took apart one of these so you can kind of see around the circumference of the record are 7 small grooves, and so when you pull the string and it begins to spin, it catches at a different moment and therefore will play an unpredictable voice track. And if you read the kind of patent language around this, Ryan writes, the doll will in effect talk with or have a conversation with the child playing with the doll making statements at random which are unexpected and unanticipated, just as the saying of a young child are unpredictable and are identified with the child's personality. And so this kind of randomization mechanism, of course, necessitates that you write a script for the doll that's fairly open-ended, right? Like prompts for play, like feed me, I'm tired, whatever. And if you look at different translations of the Chatty dolls around the world, what's kind of interesting is that some of them are more interactive than others. So in some French models, for example, she primarily makes declarative statements. She'll just be like, I'm beautiful. Great, rather than saying like, I'm hungry, right, or take me somewhere. So, but again, I think what's kind of in common here, and this is a doll from the 90s that works a little bit differently, but it was easier to take apart. But the key here is sort of thinking about how interactivity, again, is sort of defined in these same terms, which is unpredictability and randomness, to sort of think about. And when you look at kind of contemporary playthings, a 2017 study of kids kind of playing with Cognitoy's Dinosaur, which uses Watson, and Hello Barbie, found that the children did note the kind of looping tendencies of both of these toys, and in the Dino they sort of recognized that they could stretch the loop a bit further, right? Like the Dinosaur, they could get to say more things, but interactivity was conceived of in very similar terms, right? The idea that we're surprised by what the dinosaur will say, and we want to sort of reach the limits of what can be said, and that's what's sort of fun about it. So in other words, it gave maybe a greater range of interactivity, but its limitation were kind of equivalent. So I think, Nigel Thrift writing in 2003, his point about considering this sort of narrow definition of truly interactive toys is really important, and it's important to kind of recognize what makes, some forms of interactivity different and sort of more adaptable. But I think that historical case studies suggest that perhaps sometimes interactivity becomes equated with play value. And that separating these two concepts out can be really helpful. So if we think about certain definitions of play value, Kudrowitz and Wallace, toy design educators ask, does a toy product afford activities that are enjoyable, captivating, intrinsically motivated, and process-focused? Matthew Geilen writes, does the toy have a coherent set of characteristics that facilitate a core activity for the intended users in the associated environments for use and context? And so I think alongside critical discussions of interactivity in today's I/O toys, we can also ask what interactivity has looked like in various historical moments and how specific features have shaped a toy's play value. And this broad range of case studies, even looking at something so unrelated as a rubber ball, helps us to kind of highlight Mascaroni and Holloway's point that good I/O toy design needs to incorporate the same design principles as traditional, conventional toy design. So before concluding, I wanted to offer just some brief observations related to the distinct archival challenges that I/O toys present. Many of the case studies I've introduced today featured connected playthings that are already obsolete. Crayola has moved through several versions of its Color Live app, and these products are increasingly difficult to find in stores. So increasingly I'm turning to third-party buyers and eBay to get augmented reality bandages and things like that. And Hasbro has noted that Play-Doh Touch's app, within the user agreement, it says the app will only be operational for a limited period of time as determined by us in our sole and absolute discretion. So we don't even know when the sunset period for it will be, right? So there are kind of ethical considerations around, families that invest money and children that invest emotion in these toys that might not last forever. But there are also, of course, kind of other questions related to obsolescence. So here are two that I actually wanted to bring today, and the apps are no longer available. And so I had them archived, but the App Store said, nope, never again. So this was a sad learning moment for me to think about. So what I want to kind of just advocate for is to sort of think about, how important it is for academic institutions and industry stakeholders to build and maintain robust archives of this material. Such archives, I think, would ideally collect and preserve networks of physical, textual, and visual materials. There we are. Such as software, and we can think about the apps themselves, but also the operating systems. Hardware, so when is the operating system no longer compatible with the device? And of course the toy interfaces themselves. And all of these, of course, are made of different materials, so plastic, polyester, rubber, these all kind of require different preservation concerns as well. But then alongside these kinds of components, I would strongly advocate for kind of saving things like packaging, instructions, websites, which if you think the website will be there forever, it won't. You'll be redirected to the next new product. And so the importance of saving the HTML files, kind of backing that material up, the regulatory material such as terms of service, user agreements, and of course patents and things like that. And these kinds of bundles, I think, would be really kind of helpful for researchers and for folks in the industry looking to sort of inspiration of the past and thinking about how to improve upon it for the future as well. So by way of conclusion, I hope to have demonstrated that a turn toward multidisciplinarity and particularly historically oriented inquiry in the study of connected playthings can make a valuable contribution. This approach offers a chance to draw from an expanded set of methods and frameworks, and from procedures favored by practitioners of media archaeology and material culture studies to performance and childhood studies. And I think many of these really complement ongoing research in digital play today. I'm just really struck by some of the continuities, but also some of the ways that these other methods can inform what's going on in digital research. Connections and method, of course, also open up new possibilities for collaborations across disciplines, linking digital researchers with historians, cultural theorists, and archival professionals. So a lot of my work, for example, has been sponsored by the Rutgers University Digital Study Center, which maintains Arcade, the Rutgers Camden Archive of Digital Ephemera. And so they've sponsored a lot of my work, even with talking dolls, right, many of which are not digital, right? Here at Aarhus University, I know there's a new Center for Digital History, which is doing some really exciting work as well. And so it's worth sort of considering what opportunities across disciplines and between disciplines, among disciplines, and between universities and industry there might be to support one another in kind of archiving and sort of working with this material, and what kinds of funding resources might be available as well. Greater importance to the consideration of industrial, technological, and cultural legacies of toys is really central to informing our current and ongoing practices in product design and cultural response. I hope that the methods sampled today offer potential contributions in a variety of settings, and again, this is from research and development labs and policymaking environments to research contexts, to really shape and inform everyday user encounters with technologies. Historical case studies, as I've suggested, can problematize some of the temporal and technological boundaries that we conventionally draw around connected playthings, and call attention to larger genealogies of concepts like toys as media and interactivity, which I think drawing upon these sort of genealogies allows us to challenge some of those kind of extreme or sort of uninformed responses today. Troubling these categories offers a vital challenge to this kind of polarized celebratory or critical discourse, and these methods, I think, are also, as I mentioned, inextricably tied to questions of the archive and sort of thinking about how cultural memory informs possible futures. The necessity of archiving and preserving these materials and augmenting ethnographic and experiential approaches with other forms of analysis are critical components to a more holistic understanding of what's going on. So it's my hope that these tools have provided provocative sort of possibilities to think around, regardless of what kind of stakeholder you are as a product designer or a policymaker or as a researcher. Thanks.